Day 2 of America's nightmare. Millions of Americans and the rest of the world are still in shock at the horror of Tuesday's attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The US Congress is meeting at the moment to agree a $20 billion package for emergency relief efforts. In the last 2 hours, President Bush returned to Washington to visit the Pentagon building damaged in Tuesday's attack. He shook hands with rescue workers at the scene and said he was overwhelmed at the devastation he saw there. In New York, the destruction continues. In the last few hours, the remaining 7 stories of the World Trade Center complex began to collapse. Rescue workers and media teams were evacuated as engineers warned of the imminent collapse of the remnants of nearby One Liberty Plaza. Our correspondent James Robbins has been looking at the day's events.
America woke up this morning to confront the second day of a nightmare. The majesty of the New York dawn and the ugliness of the smoke drifting over Manhattan's scarred skyline tell the world nothing will ever be quite the same again. All around the peeled remnants of the World Trade Center, night had been dedicated to rescue. But it was dispiriting work faced with a weight of masonry that suggests death, not survival. A very few survivors have been found in the ruins, but it will take weeks to establish the number and the names of the dead.
The best estimate that we can make, relying on the Port Authority and just everyone else that has experience with this, is that there'll be a few thousand people left in each building.
As well as those missing, at least 200 firefighters are now known to have died, as well as 260 emergency service workers. And of course, all those on board the planes were killed. With Tony Blair now fearful that hundreds of Britons are among the victims, most of the dead must still be buried. Only 55 bodies have so far been found in the New York rubble. Even so, at least 6 people have been dug out alive, and there are still tiny flickers of hope for a few more.
We do believe that there are still people alive in the rubble. There have been some indications of cell phone communications.
And today, new images of the attacks are still emerging. This was a maintenance crew on routine duty in Manhattan as the first airliner smashes into the World Trade Center. The fallout, the dust and the debris from the fires and later the skyscraper's collapse literally chased terrified New Yorkers through their own city. It was an act of war, today's headlines shout, and few Americans would disagree. Some New Yorkers did come out to work, but the mood could not have been more somber.
My heart is just heavy. I just feel hurt, personally hurt. If it happened to me, it's just tragic.
I just hope we respond quickly. I think there should be a military response.
President Bush shares that resolution. F-16 fighters escorted him aboard Air Force One immediately after the attacks. And now it's emerged the presidential plane and the White House were apparently on the terrorists' target list, which can only increase George Bush's determination to hit back hard.
This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life. This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover. But it won't be able to run for cover forever. This is an enemy that tries to hide, but it won't be able to hide forever. This is an enemy that thinks its harbors are safe, but they won't be safe forever. This enemy attacked not just our people, but all freedom-loving people everywhere in the world.
The challenge to the United States could hardly be greater, and George Bush is looking to his allies for support. The Pentagon in Washington was devastated by the 3rd plane to hit. America's military headquarters is still being searched for traces of hundreds more civilian and service personnel who are missing.
So let's go find him. Come on.
Amid all this dreadful uncertainty, in New York today, Brenda Schonholt set out with her daughters to look for her husband. He worked in the World Trade Center She's heard no news of him since the attack.
We're asking everyone to move back.
Now, the people that were evacuated from the World Trade Center, where would they be right now?
Unfortunately, they are all over.
Officer, they're looking for their father who was in the building.
I understand. Unfortunately, my wife was in the building, and I still haven't heard from my wife.
But with mobile phones finally working again, they heard of a sighting and then a reunion. Amid all the carnage and despair, at least a little space for happiness. And in Washington, still reeling from the onslaught, the members of the United States Congress regrouped after fleeing the Capitol yesterday.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
They sang in anger, sorrow and defiance as America sends the strongest possible signal it means to fight back. The next days and weeks take the United States and the wider world into uncharted territory. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, in the past hour, President Bush has been visiting the Pentagon building in Washington, part of which was badly damaged in Tuesday's attacks. He shook hands with rescue workers, saying he was overwhelmed at the devastation.
I am so grateful for the people who are working here. We're here to say thanks to not only the workers on this site, but the workers who are doing the same work in New York City. I want to say thanks to the folks who have given blood to the Red Cross. I want to say thanks for the hundreds and thousands of Americans who pray for the victims and their families. Secretary Rumsfeld told me when I talked to him that he felt the blast shake the Pentagon. Even though he was on the other side of the building rocked. And now I know why. Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share, by people who are willing to destroy people's lives because we embrace freedom.
As the people of New York and Washington struggle to cope with the devastation, stories are beginning to emerge of the bravery of those caught in yesterday's attacks. In particular, tributes are being paid to the firefighters and rescue services in New York, many of whom lost their lives trying to save others.
With dawn, some measure of the damage. Fine silt and twisted metal, all that remains of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, the workplace of 50,000 people, until 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. No one knows how many actually died, only that hundreds perished because they went to rescue the injured and got caught in the aftermath. This is Engine Company 30, where every fireman died. Another team of fire crews is moving in to take the place of their dead comrades.
People are feeling like they lost their family, because everybody knows somebody that's been here, that at the fire and died. Brothers, friends, relatives, and it's the worst day the fire department has ever had.
Why are people moving here? Why has this fire department moved here particularly?
Because the companies that are here lost all their members in the engine and truck company.
And a city fearing the worst, a hushed New York with little moving apart from ambulances and police, and increasingly the occasional hearse. Doctors have not been working flat out, simply because the injured remained where they died. But a city queues to give blood. Blood donation centers have been crowded. Lines of determined people, angry people.
And I'm here because I love freedom and humanity. So help me. Just like Pearl Harbor, there will be no compromise. This will not ever happen again.
Amid the unfolding personal tragedies, people here also feel outrage at an attack on a city they love. In that gap was the very symbol of New York, those two twin towers that were on T-shirts, the logo of this city, now not there, just a gap. Stephen Evans, BBC News, New York.
As more bodies are recovered from the rubble, grief is quickly turning to anger in the United States. There's a strong belief that the attacks may have been planned by a group from the Arab world, and the effects are already being felt on America's streets. Hussein Ibish is from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee in Washington, and he joins me now. Mr. Ibish, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to BBC News.
Certainly, any time.
We've heard that there's been retaliation in some parts of the United States against Arabs. Can you tell us about some of the incidents that you've heard of?
Yes, unfortunately, Arab Americans are put in the position of bearing a double burden now. We were as much attacked as any other part of the United States, and I think there were hundreds of Arab Americans inside the World Trade Center, and I think by the time the bodies are out, we'll know that many Arab Americans were among the dead. However, Arab Americans are now also facing the burden of being seen by some people in the United States as representing the guilty. So we're victim and culprit at the same time in the minds of some people, and that has led to incidents such as the accosting and beating of cab drivers, Arabs and also Sikh individuals mistaken for Arabs because of their turbans and dark complexion. We've had some shootings in the directions of mosques. We've had Arab American social workers attacked in Chicago. We've had a countless number of threats. Police have been in our offices here in D.C. all day, protecting mosques all over the country, patrolling, and all Arab and Muslim organizations that I know in the United States have been inundated with the most vicious death threats. And I myself received death threats on the radio from callers on radio talk shows after having spent 45 minutes denouncing this heinous crime and expressing our sympathy and solidarity. That was the reaction from some of the callers, to tell me personally I would be wiped out. So the anger is palpable, and the target is, unfortunately, the perfectly innocent Arab American community, as much a victim of this as any other part of the United States.
But the police are treating these reported attacks very seriously.
They're treating it extremely seriously. I must say, there are a couple of very positive elements to this story, as well as the very frightening element that as grief turns to anger, we do fear greater and greater problems for our community. But there has been an outpouring of support as well. Very positive statements from the Attorney General John Ashcroft, from Secretary of State Powell, and above all, the reaction of the police in metropolitan D.C., in Chicago, in Philadelphia, and other places has been absolutely outstanding. They take this very seriously, and that tells us that we are not being paranoid and we are not reading more into the situation than is there, because they have confirmed that they think these threats are extremely serious. But they have been outstanding. They have been superb in every instance, providing protection and behaving exactly as one would want the police to behave in a moment like this. So there are elements of our society which are rallying around and saying, yes, the criminals must be punished, as we agree, but the innocent should not be just because of their religion or ethnicity. And that, I think, is one of the positive stories here.
But in cities like Washington and New York, police officers are needed on the ground with the search and rescue efforts, aren't they? They don't need to be diverted away from serious attacks like you've just described.
Well, I don't believe that police are being diverted. Frankly, I think that there's plenty of people devoted to search and rescue. And I think that the police set their own priorities. All we do is inform them of threats, and when they want to respond appropriately, they do. And I think we're glad of it. I don't believe that the small efforts that have been made to provide protection to exposed and threatened Arab American institutions is any distraction or detraction from the vital work of search and rescue, which we support wholeheartedly. And as I said before, we feel as much a victim of these attacks as any other part of this country, and we stand hand in hand with our fellow American citizens in anger and shock and disgust at these heinous attacks.
Hussein Ibish from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, thank you very much for talking to us.
Anytime.
Now, as we said, New Yorkers are still in shock, trying to come to terms with the devastation as events continue to unfold. Well, our correspondent, Robert Piggott, is there. Robert, it's nightfall, but the crowd are still out in force, I can see, supporting the emergency services.
Yes, they are. This is a critical time in what's going on down at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. And what you're seeing here is a change of shift almost in the teams of people who are trying to excavate any remaining survivors from the ruins and, of course, bodies as well. There have been a handful of survivors brought out, but because of the nature of what happened with jet airliners crashing into a building which then collapsed into what almost amounts to dust, it is very difficult to see many more people coming out, and I think we're being prepared for very bad news, although specific figures as to casualties haven't been mentioned. Here on this warm evening in Manhattan, there is a very definite smell of dust and smoke in the air. Some people are wearing masks as they come down here to applaud the rescue workers as they come back. A solid stream of trucks containing people with hard hats on, other people, medical staff, firemen, and police cars all streaming up and down this western side of Manhattan Island. Now, with me are three of the people who've come to join this crowd this evening to applaud the workers as they come in and out of the dreadful scenes down on the southern tip of Manhattan that we have seen on our television screens and which they are working in at the moment. Renee Dale, you are one of them. Why have you come out this evening?
To lend my support for all the people, the firemen, the police department, the entire infrastructure being put to work, and just to lend our support and thank them, because we know that as horrific as this has been, it would have been far worse without these people here tonight.
Jay Feather, President Bush said in his address to the nation that this was a cowardly attack, but America had responded with some of its best people, people like the fire crews who went in there in terrible danger and tried to effect a rescue. Is that why you're here?
Yeah, I mean, initially we sent, firemen who were trained, firemen and women trained to rescue those that were in there, and unfortunately those are some of the first few fatalities that we hear about, are the firemen and the policemen and women who were there. So I'm here to support whoever is now going down. Each bus, each fire department member who goes down, they need the support. I mean, I'm sure what they're seeing is not pleasant. It's very hard. It's their job, and we need the support as much as we can.
Laurie Lipson, you were saying that you know of people who have been killed in this terrible disaster. Is that partly what's motivating this sense of defiance among people?
I just think the proximity to all of our lives, everybody that it's touched, and just knowing that it's 2 miles away from our home, and it just puts everything into perspective.
You know people who are unaccounted for?
I know people who know people.
What sort of mood has that left the city in?
It's sad, it's hard. I mean, people aren't coping right, and, like they explained, we really need to get out there and support, because there's tons of other people out there who we still don't know where they are, and you just want to try and get through it and then deal with the aftermath.
Jay, I think another thing that's happened is that there's been a real sense of defiance, but also the debate has started now over what America should do. Should it respond, and if so, how? What's your feeling about that?
We should respond. We will respond. We will track the facts. We'll get the facts. We need to have them clear, and then we need response from our country and those that are our allies, those in the Middle East that need to also condemn this, and we need full world support. It's a world that has been created smaller in this century, and we need that support now, and we're getting it from our NATO officials, and there will be a response. We just have to do it the right way.
Laurie, Jay and Renee, thank you very much for joining us. This has been billed by the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, as the biggest manhunt now in American history. There are over 7,000 FBI staff trying to track down the people who carried out this outrage, and they are determined to find them.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. Robert Piggott reporting there live from New York. Well, the US Attorney General has said that some of the suspected terrorists were trained as pilots in the United States. And he said that law enforcement officers had a number of credible leads. The FBI said they'd identified many of the hijackers and their associates, but had not yet made any arrests.
Boston this afternoon, and a raid on a hotel by heavily armed police. From searches like this, from the passenger lists of the doomed planes, from car hire companies and from the internet, America's law enforcement agencies say they're gathering a wealth of credible leads. Already they've identified many of the hijackers.
We also have identified through a number of leads, principally at the cities of origin, a number of individuals whom we believe may have had something to do with the hijackings, and we are pursuing those leads aggressively.
Investigators are already working at the 3 airports used by the suicide hijackers, whose extraordinarily tight timetable meant they had control of 4 aircraft in the sky inside 15 minutes, ensuring a sequence of attacks so rapid that the authorities had no time to respond. United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles took off at 2 minutes to 8 in the morning. 1 minute later, an American Airlines plane, Flight 11, left, also bound for LA, with another hijacked team on board. 2 minutes after that, the doomed United Flight 93 to San Francisco set off from Newark. And at 8:10, the final hijacked team was airborne from Washington on board American Airlines Flight 77 to LA. It was the second plane to take off which hit the World Trade Center first. The earlier flight from Boston then came in from a different direction and struck the other tower. The flight from Washington looped back and crashed into the Pentagon. Finally, the airliner from Newark came down in rural Pennsylvania, possibly bound for the Camp David presidential retreat. The terrorists had done their homework. At least one of the airports they chose has been recently fined for poor security. To inflict maximum casualties, they targeted long-distance flights, with tanks carrying fuel for 6 hours in the air. Experts say the 4 hijackings were easy.
Security in America is, putting it probably lightly, is lax. In some places it's non-existent. Now, we're told these people only got on with knives, but knives are enough to control an aeroplane. And if you're determined, and it really depends on the determination of the hijacker, whether he takes control of the aeroplane. They obviously were very determined.
At Boston Airport, police seized a hire car with an Arabic language flight manual on the back seat. A video on how to fly airliners was also found. Those hunting them believe at least some of the hijackers learned to fly in America. Through their spy satellites and listening stations like Menwith Hill in Yorkshire, the American intelligence agencies are believed to have intercepted communications linking yesterday's attacks to associates of the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden. As many as 30 people may have been involved in the attacks.
The day-to-day organization of this, which will have taken months to set up, and the decision to go on the particular day at the particular time and to get all the timings right, that decision has to be made somewhere in North America. And it seems to me that there are a lot of American elements in this whole hijack drama. Whoever is ultimately responsible, a lot of the people who were involved in it were intrinsic to American society.
Investigators believe they know who many of the hijackers were, but pinpointing those who organized the mass murder is likely to take considerably longer. George Eakin, BBC News.
NATO allies have agreed to adopt collective defence measures for the first time ever if Washington can prove that yesterday's terrorist attacks were masterminded from abroad. The 19 members of the NATO Council would invoke Article 5, which states an attack on one member is an attack on the whole alliance. The Secretary-General, Lord Robertson, said NATO could provide an armed response if the US asks for it.
Flags of the 19 member states flying at half-mast, NATO met for the 3rd time in 24 hours to discuss how to help America. It ended up invoking Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, promising to come to America's defence if it's established that the attacks on New York and Washington originated abroad.
Article 5 of the Washington Treaty stipulates that in the event of attacks falling within its purview, each ally will assist the party that has been attacked by taking such action as it deems necessary. Accordingly, the United States NATO allies stand ready to provide the assistance that may be required as a consequence of these acts of barbarism.
The move came at the end of a day when European Union foreign ministers held a crisis meeting and repeatedly stressed that they regarded the attacks as directed not just against the United States, but against them all. They declared Friday a day of mourning in Europe, and there was more to come.
I think the United States, I hope, will be content and happy with the draft which calls for action to be taken to deal with the terrorists and for them to be punished.
So NATO has decided to respond collectively to the attacks on America, but it's not yet clear what that will mean. The treaty allows each member to decide what kind of assistance to provide, not necessarily military. And then there's the question of who will be targeted. Unlike the days of the Cold War, when the enemy was obvious, here the enemy remains as yet unidentified. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, at NATO headquarters in Brussels.
President Bush says the United States now faces a type of enemy it had never faced before. If America does wish to undertake military action, it has several options. Afghanistan is hundreds of kilometres away from the nearest US forces, but it's well within the range of America's long-range firepower. The aircraft carrier USS Vinson in the Persian Gulf has more than 60 warplanes plus a battle group, including more than a dozen escort missile-carrying surface ships. Cruise missiles could be fired from the ships or launched from the aircraft. Another aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, was heading home from the Gulf towards the United States, but was abruptly stopped in the Indian Ocean. It has the same complement of ships and aircraft as the Vinson. And the US military base on the tiny island of Diego Garcia has been used before by American B-1 bombers to launch cruise attacks on Afghanistan.
The Pentagon at dawn this morning, the heart of America's military might, deeply wounded, deeply traumatized. But the military hardware controlled from here is still in place. The ships, the planes, the soldiers, all at a high state of readiness. Their commanders on morning television talking openly of war.
American people have a clear understanding that this is a war. It's the way they see it. You can't see it any other way, whether legally that is correct or not.
You do too?
And yes, I do. And we've got to respond as if it is a war. And we've got to respond in the sense that it isn't going to be solved with a single counterattack against one individual. It's going to be a long-term conflict.
But one individual is looking very likely to be the first target for an American strike. Osama bin Laden is known to fund and train a network of anti-American terror groups from his base in Afghanistan. To attack him, America has three difficult options. The use of cruise missiles has been tried before and failed. Airstrikes might work, but there'd be a risk of hitting civilians. Or ground forces could be sent in, with a big risk of more American casualties. There is a fourth option. America's friends in the Middle East will be pointing to the extraordinary scenes of some Muslims celebrating yesterday's horror and asking America to ask itself why it is so hated.
They should look at political solutions. Why the American administration is hated in the Middle East and all over the Muslim world. Definitely there is something wrong in the American foreign policies. They have to look at this, and they have to listen to their friends in Europe and in the Middle East.
Tonight, though, America's Secretary of State was sticking to his message that a war had begun.
Our spirits will not be broken. The resilience of this society will not be broken. We will find out who is responsible for this, and they will pay for it.
Off the coast of New York City, the aircraft carrier George Washington, a potent symbol of America's ability, should it choose, to hit back. Justin Webb, BBC News.
Well, airports around the world remain clogged with stranded passengers after flights to the United States were halted and all US internal flights grounded. Airports in the United States have now reopened on a limited basis. High security measures are now in place, including passenger and vehicle screening. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Michael Codner, who's a security expert. Mr. Codner, welcome to the studio. Thank you very much for joining us. Some experts, some British experts, have been saying that security in the United States, particularly at airports, has been lax in the extreme. So therefore, possibly we shouldn't have been surprised that these hijackers managed to get knives on board.
Well, yes, one's experience is that things are very much easier in terms of security in the States, but one has to say that this kind of attack, which has been very carefully planned, obviously would have taken into account the fact that there may have been security defences on the day, and quite clearly they used weapons which would have got through the American security process. Indeed, they could have used weapons which would have got through any security process.
Such as?
Well, they could have used garrotes, they could have used nail scissors. We're talking about Stanley knives here, which are, or perhaps razor blades, which aren't weapons which would normally perhaps even be found in the British system, which is one of the most secure.
It brings it home to people like me. Possibly you think I'm being very naive here, that it doesn't seem to take very much in terms of equipment to be able to hijack a plane. It's all in the organisation.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what is special about this particular hijacking is the scale of the event and the structure and the organising. And I think a point that must be made is that there's only a certain amount in any counter-terrorist action that you can do in actually protecting. The rest of it is actually, and perhaps by far the biggest part, is in the intelligence preparation and what goes on before. There's only a limit to what you can actually do ever to protect a population against terrorism.
So how will that have to change then, given that there is only a limited amount that you can do? What has got to change? Because the American public and people around the world are going to expect some kind of change to the way intelligence and security is organised.
Well, the Americans have a huge intelligence organisation, and very frequently when there are large mistakes, it's not so much that the intelligence forces are not doing their job properly, it's because they perhaps have their backs to the problem at the time. They are concentrating on something different. It's very much a matter of the tasking at the time, and that's very much a matter of what the strategic threat is perceived to be at the time.
I mean, we're talking, people in America particularly, talking about trying to get back to normal, to show that the terrorism will not win, that it will cause a minimum amount of disruption, but of course things never will be the same again, will they?
No, inevitably, not only in America but throughout the world, it's going to be very much more difficult to get swiftly through an airport and onto your aircraft. It's going to take longer, it's going to be more expensive for airlines, and it's going to be more, and the prices are going to be reflected in tickets, etc.
We've heard talk of missile defence shields and systems like that. Terrorists only need to get lucky once, don't they? States need to be vigilant the whole time.
Absolutely, and preparations against terrorism inevitably are going to be a matter of being proportionate to what the threat is. You can only do so much to ring central London and allow central London to function. And the significance of this event is that the crisis has been so huge and the damage has been so vast that the proportionality has all been so distorted, which is what makes it so very significant and so very worrying for anyone involved in counter-terrorism.
Indeed. Michael Codner, thank you very much.
Thank you.
But why were New York's financial district and the Pentagon targeted? It's still not known who carried out the attacks. No credible claims of responsibility have been made. But many analysts believe the hijackings were motivated by a desire to strike at the United States policy towards the Middle East.
Half a world away from the flattened streets of New York, American and British pilots still patrol the no-fly zones over Iraq. Dozens of planes and thousands of service people are deployed across the Middle East to try and contain the government in Baghdad. Whilst many Arabs have little time for Saddam Hussein, they're increasingly concerned about the plight of Iraq's people. And after 11 years of economic sanctions, it's the United States they blame. But across the Arab and Islamic worlds, it's the Palestinian people who generate most sympathy, and Israel the most ill-feeling. Every year, Israel receives up to $5 billion in American aid, money which buys these attack helicopters, and which for its critics directly implicates the US in oppression. Bill Hayton, BBC News.
Well, joining me now in the studio is Anjem Choudary from the Islamic Front in Britain. Mr. Choudary, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the studio.
You're welcome.
Can you shed any light on why you think perhaps the Pentagon and the World Trade Center were targets for these terrorists?
Yes. I would like to make a point, as one of the few Muslims who have been able to be interviewed by the BBC, that the way that the issues have been portrayed over the last 2 days have the focus on Islamic fundamentalism and fanaticism and militancy has meant that Muslims in Great Britain and America, like one of your guests has said earlier, are being targeted, despite the fact that we've made it very clear that the use of civilian airplanes and the targeting of civilian buildings is something which is completely unacceptable as far as the Sharia is concerned. And I think that
and many Arab states have also said that actions like this are against the teachings of Islam. You'd agree with that?
Absolutely. And really the focus of attention, rather than being on atrocities being committed, for example, in Israel and in Iraq, and perhaps some of the reasons why action is being taken at the present time against the American government, has shifted instead to the age-old pejoratives and the age-old portrayal of Islam as some type of medieval religion and and gun-totting fundamentalists who.
But if these are the targets that these terrorists have chosen, if they do indeed turn out to be Muslim fundamentalists, this kind of outrage and condemnation is inevitable. They picked the wrong target if they wanted sympathy. It seems that the death toll of civilians at the World Trade Center could run into thousands. That is no way, surely, to gain sympathy towards whatever message it is they're trying to get across.
Well, I would reiterate that there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Muslims are behind what's taking place in New York, and that if it turns out that Muslims are involved, then really, rather than looking for a response and to look to where the Americans and the British want to bomb, and we've had absurd suggestions that perhaps Pakistan or Afghanistan could be a legitimate target.
Why is that absurd? Why is that absurd?
Well, I mean,
if Osama bin Laden is harboured by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, why isn't Afghanistan then a legitimate target if the United States, and possibly with NATO support, decides that that is the retaliation and response they need to give? Why is that
I think
not
what the
right?
the response of the Muslims to this would be that why have not the same measures been taken against the US-backed UN resolutions and sanctions in Iraq, which have killed over 1 million children, the backing of the Israeli atrocities in Palestine, in Sabra and Shatila, 18,000 Muslims were killed, and there was no such action being taken against the Israelis.
Whatever anyone's views on that, none of that justifies the carnage and the death toll that we've seen in the United States, particularly in New York, which wasn't even a military installation that was being targeted.
Yes, if you
How can you justify that? Are you justifying that?
I'm not justifying. I've said to you very clearly that the Sharia states perfectly well that civilians are not to be targeted in war.
But they have been.
Well, that's unacceptable, and we would be the first people to condemn that. If it turns out that Osama bin Laden or any Islamic movement or jihadi movement is behind the atrocities which have been committed, and the ones which we have been in the forefront of saying that are illegitimate, nevertheless, you know, if Osama bin Laden was harboring, for example, in Birmingham, I don't think that the American regime would bomb Birmingham. You need to talk, you know, there needs to be debate and discussion, and there needs to be dialogue.
It's highly unlikely that Britain would allow someone like Osama bin Laden, who's connected but has always denied but supported the idea of terrorist attacks on this scale, highly unlikely that he'd be harboured in Britain. Let me just ask you one other thing. If you think that this is supposed to be a wake-up call, whether they've gone about it in the right way or not, just very briefly, what message do you hope the United States will take from it, just briefly?
I think that they must look at the facts about their foreign policy and the way that the Muslims worldwide, I hasten to add, who are not represented by the tyrant regimes in the Arab world, feel about, especially concerning the issue of Israel and the issue of Iraq, and indeed the presence of US forces on Muslim soil. If they can deal with these type of issues, I think we can have a much better relationship with the Americans and the British.
Anjem Choudary from the Islamic Front in Britain, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Palestinian security sources say Israeli forces have moved into the Palestinian-controlled town of Jericho. It's the second Israeli incursion into a Palestinian town in as many days. Eyewitnesses say they've counted as many as 20 tanks and that people have gone out on the streets of the West Bank town to protest against the Israeli action. Senior Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat lives in Jericho and he joins me now on the line. Mr. Erekat, welcome to BBC News. Thank you for joining us.
A pleasure.
Can you just first of all give us your reaction to this latest incursion by Israel into Jericho?
This is absolutely uncalled for. You know, I think Sharon believes that the attention of the BBC and the world is concentrated now on the tragedies of New York and Washington, and he may feel now that he can do anything and get away with it. Jericho is under total assault and total attack. There are more than 30 tanks now entering the town. We don't have tanks, we don't have a navy, we don't have an army, but people are resisting. The church bells are ringing, the mosques are calling on people to take to the streets. It's a very ugly scene out there, and there's many shooting taking place. And we really, you know, think that, you know, after the dust settles down from New York and Washington, that this will be an eye-opener to the policymakers in Washington and London and Europe, that the source of all evil in this region and the source of extremism, the source of the cycle of violence and counter-violence has been the continuation of the Israeli occupation. Israel cannot continue to be the last occupying power on earth, and they really must put an end to this.
But many countries around the world are following the lead of the United States and tightening their security arrangements. Could Israel argue that that's what they're doing in Jericho.
Ma'am, there was nothing in Jericho, nothing around Jericho. Jericho is a peaceful town. There was no shooting incidents. I'm sure if there were any shootings or any Israeli killed, it would have been reported by you. This was absolutely with no pretext whatsoever, as usually pretexts. This is an all-out assault in the city of Jenin. I heard now there are much concentrations of tanks around the cities of Nablus, Tulkarem, Qalqilia, and certain portions of Gaza. I really think that Sharon thinks that now it's his moment to go ahead in undermining the Palestinian Authority and destroying the peace process and creating facts on the ground by his tanks. I think if he thinks that this will ease the situation, I think he's only adding to the complexities. We were tonight, I spoke to Miguel Moratinos and to Mr. Assistant Secretary Bill Burns in the United States, informed them about this, because hours ago we were talking about a meeting between President Arafat and Mr. Peres, possibly in the next few hours. And now he chose this path, the path of this destruction and war, and believe me, it was absolutely uncalled for. There were not one single shooting incident in the town of Jericho.
Saeb Erekat in Jericho, thank you very much. And our correspondent Barbara Plett is in Jerusalem and she joins us now. Barbara, it seems that the events in the United States could be extremely destabilizing for the Middle East.
Well, people here in the Middle East are watching what's going to happen from the fallout of the attack that took place across the ocean. Here in Israel and the Palestinian territories, both sides have different views on it. The Israelis have for quite a long time tried to portray the Palestinian uprising as a terrorist movement that has been cynically organized by the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. And now that the whole world is talking about terror, it's believed that they feel that perhaps they might get some more sympathy